Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, thank you for coming back. Those of you who came back, hands up who wasn't in the audience for the previous session. Okay, I'll whiz through quickly basically what this project is about. So this session is what we call this Community Capability Model for Data-Intensive Research. So the idea is try to, in some way, characterize communities, and the community could be a discipline, and that's kind of was the principal sort of scenario. But it could be an institution, it could be a department, it could be a research group. And to characterize using multiple axes, how a community is able to do data-intensive research. So the analogy that Dave came up with and between us was there are symptoms of a community in terms of they've got too much data. They can't share their data. The methods are starting to not scale. So there are symptoms where people are basically hitting walls with data-intensive research. There is action. There are things that you can do. You can go and build a data repository. You can open up your data, etc. But what's lacking is a way of linking what is the best action for a given community, which is a sort of diagnosis tool. And so this model, in some sense, is a sort of diagnostic tool where a community can say, hey, we've got all these problems, help. And then we can say, okay, well, it looks like you need to think about it like this. And then, okay, well, here are some avenues that you can go down in order to get it. So that's essentially, in a nutshell, what this model is doing. So these are the sort of 5 steps of the project. So we're about halfway through the project, and we've finished in the summer, and we've got a few more workshops coming up, is to basically try and build this model and say, how do you model a community? Okay, and so I went through this in a bit more detail before the break. And so now what we want to do is actually have a discussion around essentially these different axes that we're thinking about with you to figure out exactly, well, to basically see whether what we've done so far makes sense at all, and also to just get your input in terms of how we can refine that model. Yeah, question?
So one of the things you said earlier, the first slide was, it could be the target, it could be community, what community is. Are we limiting it now for the sake of this discussion to say just the science domain, or is it still kind of everything? Yeah. I think for this discussion we should play along. Play along with us now, and yes, let's do it by scientific domain, but keep in the back of your head that this model could be applied in other ways.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that Kenji talked about before is that we use multiple audiences for this. Thank you. We started out from a sort of a Microsoft Research as a funding agency. David here, Chris Menzel, we all have ways that we want to use this information. Kenji also talked about institutions using this information, but what we want you to think about when you're thinking about it from the domain perspective is also think about it from the researcher perspective. What are the things in this model that would be useful for you within your research domain to have answered?
I think the challenge is going to be, if I look at, take the health analogy a little farther. I mean, an individual's health and their issues are different than community-based health. You may make different decisions, so as long as you're aware of this. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily map one-to-one.
Yeah,
great,
sure.
So we'll expand this into a public health model then.
Fantastic. Right. So these are this is a way of mapping this, basically, which is to look at sort of human, economic, and technical areas. Okay, and I kind of went through this earlier. And so we thought the discussion here would be interesting to sort of drill down a little bit, well, have you drill down a little bit into these different areas. We are trying to think about how we're going to visualize this in a useful way. And so this is one idea, is to basically have these sort of three axes. And actually for each one of these, you could have one of those triangles, potentially. I mean, I've done a bit of work on how to visualize 25-dimensional systems. And actually you can do that if you're doing optimization and stuff. And you can actually do a grid of these things and group them in such a way that you can do that. So it's how Airbus visualizes a 25-dimensional optimization problem, for instance. I can't remember the name of the actual visualization. But you can see how here, for instance, you could say, actually, economics, yep, that's all fine. We know how to fund this. It's sustainable. It's fantastic. Technically, we've solved the problem. We can do it, and that's fine. But people don't have the skills. We need to do the training, etc. It could look something like that, for instance. So that's a way that we may visualize this. Liz Lyon, who's running the project, who's at the University of Bath, actually has just interviewed a bunch of people at Bath. A lot of the senior decision makers, the provost chancellor of research, the CIO, CFO, etc., senior researchers. Here are some of the things that came back in terms of data-intensive research. So this is an interesting one. Yeah, just when you start a project, what do? If you're a PhD student, your supervisor tells you what to do, right? Who advises the supervisor if they're coming into some new, again, there's a discipline kind of knowledge base. So again, this is actually from an institutional level in terms of how does that knowledge of skills flow down. Ad hoc. Is there actual a formal way of disseminating best practice, for instance? This is technical support, it's sort of IT level. And skills keeps coming up all the time. This is an interesting one with cloud, because the researchers can just take their credit card and buy cloud time, but is that useful? So just throw this up in terms of Liz literally did these interviews, I think, last week, and we're doing these interviews at other institutions, and we'll do these interviews with disciplines as well. So if you're interested in being interviewed in order to input into this to help us out, please let me know. So we're trying to develop this model, improve it. We've got to a point now where we've essentially drafted it, and we just want some feedback so that when we then come out with a proposed model, that it's pretty much there and just needs some of the rough edges knocked off it. So that's kind of what we want to do now, basically, for the next hour or so, I guess, is go through a few questions with you and just have a discussion, open discussion around those things. Monica is capturing all of this, and we're capturing on video as well. So this is essentially, I've tried to encapsulate this into smart art, which is a horrible thing to do. Don't worry about that. Actually, this isn't Microsoft Confidential. So we've got these three strands, basically. Okay. And so, basically the discussion is with this model, how might this help you? And if we think discipline, okay, for now. If we have time, we could maybe stretch it out into institutional or other organizational communities. So we want to kind of just open up to that. Sound okay? Yeah, great. Any questions? Not yet. Right, I'm going to fire some questions at you. Here we go. So human. So for instance here, if you think about your discipline, think about how the model could be useful in terms of being able to describe in some sense how far along you are on one of these axes. Okay, so how might this be useful if you were able to characterize your discipline, on any of these? How might you have a little think about that? Because we've been thinking about this, and it's quite hard.
When you think about it on the discipline, are rewards actually given at the discipline level?
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about tenure system, no, possibly not. But if you are there some domains where you are getting citation credit, for example, for publishing your data externally? Is it part of what it is to be doing science in your domain, to be making that data available? There's rewards and recognition that go along in that capacity.
So again, the other thing here with this model is to be able to compare your discipline with another discipline. If you see another discipline and you think, hey, they're really doing great stuff, the question here is to identify why they're doing that, or what's making them successful at that. So from a human aspect, what would be useful in terms of being able to compare your discipline or just look at your own discipline and reflect on it in comparison with other disciplines, because there are some other different disciplines. So Dave gave a talk about social science research. Came across to me was skills and training. They're doing a lot in skills and training around data reuse, data management methods and things.
Library schools.
Pardon?
The library schools are doing a lot.
Yeah. So, would it be useful, for instance, in your discipline to be able to sort of have a look at that in terms of, is that one of the, we kind of almost want to kind of prioritize these a little bit.
So is that what you're looking for, feedback on prioritization?
Or examples.
Yeah, examples.
People said, in my domain, in environmental science, we are really good at this, but we're bad at that because. Or gaps. The first two of the workshops that we did were trying to focus on doing a little bit of a gap analysis on this model, and we were looking for other sub-bullet points to put into this. So we think we like the ones that we have now, but if you say, well, you're missing something clearly here, bring those things up as well.
So if we're talking about rewards/incentives, I just yelled.
Well,
It's for the video.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that implies metrics of some sort. I mean, that would be useful, is finding out, looking across the disciplines and find out what kind of metrics we could come up with to see what kind of use, do we get paid by the terabyte? I don't know. Yeah, or it gets downloaded a lot or used in syllabi, because that's the one thing, that's what skills and training, but the one thing I really think is sort of the next generation for a lot of this data reuse. It might not actually be for science, but it is good for teaching, right? So you've got a bunch of, let's call it spent. Are folks familiar with that UCI machine learning collection that's beaten to death? The world famous iris setosis thingy, the 31 data points or whatever it is that every machine learning kid learns and use. So that kind of idea where a lot of this data can get reused as in lessons and in, maybe at master's level or undergrad level. Not so much you're going to generate new findings from it, but it is a good teaching tool as something to work with, right?
So to clarify, you're saying the usage of this model in teaching, or the use, or what the metrics are around usage of your scientific data beyond iterating.
So if you're going to generate a model for us to take, I like to have a model that I could dump in my associate vice chancellor's research office and say, look, this is what we need, right? So some things in this model are languages that might have to go into what we call communication number 9, which determines our contract, right? It is the thing that determines tenure, defines professorship at the University of Illinois, right? And every once in a while they tweak it and say what counts, right? What publications and creative works, and so maybe it's data. Like they have to say that it is data, right? It has to go towards your publications, whatever. So finding out if you're building this model is getting examples of these kinds of things and metrics of success. I mean, so those are the kinds of things that would be useful to me.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's exactly what we want to be able to capture here, is what the spectrum of answers and potential utility of those are in each domain.
I think that's an interesting topic, rewards and incentives, because if you have a limited number of hours in the day, what do? Do you kick out another paper, or do you work on sharing your data? What's worth more, right? But then there's the interesting one, which is if I write the paper and then I release my data, then I may get more citations. My reputation within the domain might go up. There's some slightly more indirect benefits than, if it takes you a week to get your data, out there or something. So these sort of trade-offs.
Or examples where people are shoehorning existing systems of citation counting, citation metrics, and using those for data sets in hopes that will sort of fold into the existing system. I've got a data set that's been cited this many times in really important papers. can this start counting? So it's trying to shoehorn into an existing model.
But if it gets used for teaching, you're not going to get that citation count, right? But it's still an impact. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I think is important. I mean, maybe there's a different model than straight citation counts, or there's got to be. I mean, because we do fetishize that.
Yeah, so what incentives are there for, and rewards are there for sharing data?
Yes.
Open question.
I got to drink some more.
So, okay, so I'm having, because mainly it's the rewards and incentives part I'm having an issue with as it relates to the human part. When I think about for domain and science, those become individual type ones usually. What I was trying to think about on this was, what for the domain, what are they really good at doing, right? So are they good at training and doing new skills training, maybe for the up and coming researchers or the students? Are they providing data sets for teaching so it can be reused? And I think the UCI one is a good one for machine learning. It's something there everyone knows about if it's in that domain. Are other domains doing the same type of thing? The first two just feel to me so individually focused that you go down that path of tenure, all these other things, right? And so, yeah, I guess I'd be interested in those last ones, but also then on the technology and some of those other ones as defining the domain.
Mandatory institutional repository thing.
Mm-hmm.
Mike's annoying.
Sorry, yeah.
Right. So if the university turns around and says we're no more submitting papers, we want to go look at what's in our institutional repository for your tenure and promotion stuff. Well, there's your sort of reward, chicken or stick and carrot kind of thing to populate your IR, right? So.
But that's outside of, again, the science. That's your university institutions, right?
Right.
So I know we're trying to make sure that's incorporated, but if you just get the science level, it'd be closer to saying, do you publish your stuff in archive, right? That's something that actually goes across the science domain.
Is there a peer review? Is there peer review for data? I mean, I think that's part of it. I don't know. Get science to stamp your data.
Yeah.
This is maybe just a little bit different, but one factor that we might look at or an indicator would be what grad students are doing. So, if grad students are doing a lot of manual labor, doing, munging data, eventually that's going to need to change if you're going to move into data-intensive science. You're going to have to automate. And so I think it may be another bullet that's missing, or maybe it's a sub-part of skills and training would be kind of grad student. Yeah, well, you're probably not going to get rid of that. I just mean, in terms of the data-intensive aspects of things, is it automated or is it grad student run? Yeah, fair enough.
So looking at our science domain, one of the areas that really is a reward for sharing data is the fact that most of the science is organized around group interdisciplinary projects. I mean, an individual scientist doesn't get a research vessel to him or herself.
Mm-hmm.
It's a team, and if you get a reputation of not sharing data, everybody say, well, you're not going to see with us again. So there's a real drive to share the data out there.
Also think about this as we started to say at the beginning, comparing your domain with other domains, because when we show this model to the crystallography community, they say, well, we are rewarded for sharing our data. When we publish a paper, it is a data paper. So that's already there. So other domains might look at that and say, how come we don't have that same approach within our domain?
I think what Mark just said is interesting because it's this dependency that in order the collaborative working is predicated on publication of data, right? Because otherwise no one's going to talk to you.
So there are two legal and ethical issues that you pop up here.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe some more. So I work in library science and music information retrieval. I'll be talking more about some of the things we've been doing. So there are two things that we can't do is that we can't share copyrighted material, right? And that is our data, right? So the one thing that the consortium of the Big Ten schools and a few other folks, the Hadi Trust, right? Essentially, it's the Google Books data, but we can't share the Google Books, right? So the model that we're building is algorithm to data, right? So essentially, they can send their tools to the Hadi Trust, and they'll run the tools. And in the music retrieval stuff, we have like terabytes of audio, music audio we cannot share, right? So we've been working with David DeRohr on building tools so that the algorithms come to us and we give the features or whatever the answer's back, right? So a lot of, and maybe some other medical data is probably similar, or I don't know, banking data might be.
Yeah, the issue of
Social
sharing that
security.
is with medical data. Clearly, that it's difficult, but you can anonymize the data, and similarly with financial data, you can anonymize the data in order to share it. I mean, it's not easy, but that's the route.
Because you always run back into that classic problem. If you have gender, age, and zip code, you can identify a person, right?
Yeah. So it'd be anonymizing. It would be not including the zip code, for instance.
Yeah,
You
which-
know, so they yeah,
Which
the value of
damages
the data.
right? That's
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're trying to do, but
Similar issue. So if you signed up to my study to study X, that's what I told you, then
yeah.
so a slightly different issue though is if you signed up to my study to study diabetes, and that's the agreement you signed when I signed you up to the study, I'm then not allowed to take the same data and study
So the UK,
hypertension.
the UK Data Protection Act says you are only allowed to collect data for a named specified purpose, and it is illegal. I can't remember, is it criminal?
I don't think it's just
Is it
UK
criminal
though.
or
This,
civil that you cannot then use the data for something else. And you
but
can
there
be
was a
fined.
case in
But-
the US with some of the Indian sort of native tribes.
I mean, the UK data protection
around
is
this.
just very draconian. Yeah, there's reasons for it. That's fine. I'm happy that when I go shopping, they don't.
So it
They
might
can't
not be
share it, so-
copyright. That's
Yeah, so it
That's
is, there are
essential.
these issues of, is there a legal requirement that gets in the way? Regulations, that's the regulation sort of side of things. So it's interesting. So,
And that's the area of anonymization of personally identifiable information is something that comes up across a lot of fields, more fields than you'd think it would. And that is, as we start pulling on strands that are consistent across domains, potential opportunity for solutions, for sharing best practices around how data gets anonymized.
so certainly when I was at Southampton, the medical school were working very hard on how to share their data, trying to figure it out. Because they could see huge value in sharing the data. Just from the fact that other medical researchers could have access to it, and therefore they would find a cure for whatever a lot quicker. So. Okay, should we move on? Does anyone else want to?
Were there any other? I know, Mark, you made a comment on collaborative working, but any other thoughts in your domains about why collaboration works really well, why it doesn't work well? Are there this is another area where the incentives come in. A lot of times, funding agencies, for example, will reward projects that collaborate across institutions, and others not. But any domain-specific examples?
There's always been contention, which is the modelers versus the observationalists. So observationalists go and spend 6 weeks at sea getting sick, and the modelers just say, send me your data. And there is a tension there between people who want to be consumers and the people who are producers of the data.
Mm-hmm.
Elaborate on that.
Because
How does that play out? Is there an impediment?
it slows things down and creates tension in the community.
So it's essentially the kind of business model for data sharing, right, in terms of return on investment for collection versus, that's interesting. One thing I would like some feedback on is in the skills and training. Let me just zoom up here because this is something that would be great. Here we go. This is just wrong. What should be that axis when we look at skills and training? is it just, is this expert user versus novice, or what are these? I don't like this. This is kind of the best we came up with, and I've been ruminating over this, and I don't like it. To be honest, I think this is.
And some of the things that we're back to the graduate student issue is, where should those skills and training, where should that happen? Should it be, how much of it should be sort of ingrained in the tools? How much of it should be ingrained in the psychology of the domain and the lingua franca of the domain? You mentioned that a lot of skills are coming, a lot of library schools right now are focusing on this sort of notion of a data librarian, but to what extent are those then moving in and embedding with the research communities rather than being reactive to, here's all my data, now you, the data librarian, do something with it. So Kenji's right. I don't think we have the right questions, the right dimensions on this training, skills and training yet.
And I don't know whether actually, because it says skills and training, I guess this is training here, isn't it? Training for undertaking. That should really read training, I think. What do we think? Because these three are on skills. Okay, so what's your skill level? So I guess you could measure skill level in terms of not being able to do something at all to being an expert, right? Is that reasonable? Is that how you measure skill? I guess that's how you do it on an Xbox game, right? You have beginner, intermediate, expert, right? Maybe that's it, beginner, intermediate, expert?
As a domain?
Well, just for these, you got that, Monica? Big yellow highlight, beginner, intermediate, expert as axis definition. That's probably as useful as, yeah, okay.
But it could also be the availability of that expertise within my domain. Yes, there are experts. There are people who know how to do it, but...
Do I have access to those people? Yeah. Good point. Okay. I think we're running out of steam on the human side.
Humans.
I have that vibe. I'm actually going to skip across to something else, which I think people will be. How do we measure software capability in a domain? What's that axis? Yeah? I kind of can do 0 to 10, but what's that? Beginner, intermediate, expert. If you were to look at another domain and you were trying to assess their domain against your domain in terms of the capability of their software stack, yeah?
The challenge I have with it is the overall, you guys got away from the maturity model to not have a ranking of comparison, and yet here we're going beginning, intermediate, expert, and so it doesn't. You seem to want to go. I think so with software, it'd be, is it mature in that they already have packaged software, or or are they everyone writing scripts, or what? I mean,
it's capability. It's the ability to do the research. And that could mean it's open source software. It could mean it's some great commercial software. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is...
Well, then capability would be, if you're saying it's the capability of the software, that doesn't go beginner to expert.
No, exactly. Okay. I need a different... Yeah, so tell me what that is.
Oh, I just think it's adequate, not adequate, essentially, right? And above. It provides a lot more services than most of the people use. Right, that there's software out there that does the things. All these are on a gradient where some of it may be fine, and it works right now, but in a year it may not be enough, right? And it'll keep moving around. So I would say something like that, where it's, because otherwise you're going to get into, well, the specific one does it for this area, but it doesn't do it for that. It's, are there enough tools that are adequate for that space, for that science area, or, or they're essentially below? And above adequate, I don't know really what that would be. That
awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I guess it's sort of inadequate in terms of they're not good enough. We really need better tools.
Right.
to
And
adequate.
if this is being essentially by each of the
fantastic.
domains, right? Say say oceanography, atmospheric sciences, something. They're the ones that are going to be saying, yeah, we got enough tools, or no, we don't, right? We're totally lacking in this area because we can't do X, Y, Z. That's why, to me, it's more of an adequate or inadequate.
Any other comments on that? Does anybody agree with that? Yeah. A few nods.
Yeah. So I don't know if it belongs on this slide, but communities are organized very differently from the perspective of the institutional environment in which they operate. So, for example, if you, I've been working with hydrologists a lot, and hydrology, a lot of data are free because they are collected by several federal agencies and put up in public domain in the US. There are public water districts that mostly when you work in this field, you deal with public water agencies. Situation is very different, say, in geology, where you have oil companies and others. And the whole idea of how you share data and whether you make your data free at what time scale would be different across communities. Another interesting feature that we noticed when you look at how hydrologic research community is organized. There are universities with researchers that and graduate students and postdocs that look at their local watersheds a lot, at their local catchments, and it would be natural to build infrastructure such that each of these places will have some data server where they would publish this data. Situation in astronomy or atmospheric sciences or in many other sciences is very different. You don't have these natural boundaries that would let the communities sort of self-organize. That results in different infrastructure. I'm not sure if it was this slide or this one, but
there's a few different tease that apart into a few different areas. Some of them are technical, some of them are political, legal constraints on it.
So if there is discussion of these points, or I can move on.
Keep going, or unless someone else has got a comment. Keep going. Please.
There are several projects at NSF where communities are supposed to get together. One of them is critical zone observatories, which is a bunch of observatories that get together to look at data from bedrock to lower atmospheric layer, essentially looking at geology, geochemistry, hydrology, and so on. And this is where this problem of how that different community interfaces to is very important. And a typical claim is how they find geochemical data that is related to the area that I'm looking at. So an assumption is that there is some catalog that you can go to and find this data, and typically there is no single catalog that the community would support. And there is no system of how you would federate different catalogs. So capability to do that would imply that you publish your catalogs in some standard manner, and you have tools for going between either brokering requests or harvesting content of other catalogs.
So that's
the second issue.
Discovery and access.
Right.
One is and integration.
Representation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so on the domain level, it's how you publish this catalog, and cross-domain is how you federate across these published catalogs.
How would you characterize then within that domain, how would you characterize the gradients? What are we measuring on? Is it data standards? Is it tooling? Is it
Well, I think
there are certain data standards in this domain. There is catalog services for the web, from what you see. That is being used quite widely, especially in the last couple of years when there's standard software to support it. It mostly works for simple things, better works. And when you have different types of catalogs where you need to integrate credit data and point observations, then it turns out that different implementations of CSW don't work together very well. It's one issue. Second, you can find something in another catalog, you still need to interpret it. And then it turns out that your local vocabularies that you use to publish your data in one catalog may be quite different than other vocabularies.
So that's representation, I guess, is it?
In the hydrologic catalog for water quality, we have about 18,000 variables. It's hard to figure out what you want, but if you look at geochemical variables catalogs, they may have also quite significant number of entries, and these names will be different. So silica in hydrologic catalog will be SiO2 in geochemical catalog. Same thing, but there are different norms.
I think that comes under standardization, doesn't it? Do you have standard ontologies and taxonomies and mapping of taxonomies across?
Right. So if the ontologies are expressed in standard way, right, which could be SCOS, RDF, file, whatever, and if there is crosswalks between them, that would solve the problem. But one of the criteria here, one of the metrics could be how far is the community from agreeing on common semantics and from publishing.
So that, I think, comes under standards. So you've got there's a sort of separate category, I think, which is standards, which is...
I was just going to say that whether it comes under standards is quite an interesting issue, because it's whether or not, so taking the kind of the SCOS as an example, it's whether you're creating centrally an agreed mechanism, or whether you're going for a process where you have loads and loads of SCOS mappings which are agreed on a case-by-case basis, where you effectively build up a community of shared understanding. So it's not necessarily a kind of a quote-unquote standards issue. It's a whole question about disciplinary practice.
Yeah, it's how you can make a community to converge on some semantics, given that everybody understands.
So I think it comes under...
Macro level as well. It may work really well for my community with my data, but as soon as it starts, you want to overlay it with data.
This is the problem with cross-disciplinary research, right? Because the other discipline doesn't talk my language, so you have to kind of translate. So I think this topic actually isn't called standards, it's called standardization, which doesn't necessarily mean hard standards in the ISO way, but like you say, sort of agreed common practice, I guess, maybe is better. Exactly, yes. So, no, that is a very good point, actually. Have I got a slide where I can write that down? Yeah, great. Okay, let me just...
Amazing how important language is in this exercise.
There we go, yes.
In hydrology, we started with that common agreement, kind of something that we referred to as standard, but it was not really standard. It was an agreement called water markup language. Developed just with the idea that it will be easy for grad students to parse it, and lowest barrier for entry for community members, and would capture sufficient semantics of what our group agreed on. And it was not compatible with ISO, OGC, and all these other things. So it turned out that it was not that difficult to map it to OGC specs. Say if you take observation and measurements, which is one of the common basic specs of OGC, then the process of mapping WaterML to that spec is actually ongoing and close to completion. It will be a standard in a few months. And now it becomes a lot more complicated with lots of cross-linking, right? So we're not that sure yet. Of course, we always hoped that researchers would not really look at XML. They would just work with some interfaces that we provide. But they do look at XML, and students look at XML, and whether they can understand it fairly quickly is a big criterion.
Any other domain perspectives pile on? Counterexamples? Which page are we on there?
I'm skipping around a little bit. We're on that page. Stay on that page. I'm just seeing where we want to go next.
Yeah, so I think maybe what we meant instead of standardization is conventions. Are there conventions within a domain, broadly speaking, or is it incredibly fragmented, incredibly difficult to bring together disparate data sources in that?
So the one thing that always struck me problematic, and it's something that I've always had trouble with. So we have our clusters, we have our big iron, and we crunch our data and the like. But very, very few of those resources are actually exposed to the web. The number of crunching resources aren't, right? So our clusters are behind firewalls and security and Kerberos keys and all that kind of stuff. But we want to expose this data and its crunching ability. So basically, we have some outward-facing web servers with like no processing power whatsoever, and bandwidth issues. Like essentially, university administration gets upset when we start moving 14 terabytes of data on the right. There's a real disconnect between what happens in our labs, right, where the stuff gets crunched, and then the secondary use, the exposure, the sharing bit, because they're two different classes of hardware, right? Two different classes of I don't know what the word I'm looking for.
So I would call that
provision. I don't know.
I would call that a cost issue.
Is that a cost? Okay.
I think it would, because
policy?
Essentially what you're saying is, if I have a set of data which would be valuable to another researcher outside of my institution, let's say, but it requires processing.
Right.
That means that I'm allowing that researcher to use my cluster, which stops one of my researchers from using my cluster.
Absolutely.
Potentially, right?
Yes.
And therefore, the return on investment to the institution in terms of should I allow that, it might do, because again, there might be some benefit back to the institution, or the institution might charge for it, for instance. So I think it's a business. I would say that's a business issue, because technically, clearly, you can do it, right? Yeah, it's easy to be able to write a web service, have some data, have a cluster, and allow someone to do that processing. The barrier is not technical. The barrier is, do you want people to do that, right? So that's quite interesting in terms of cloud, because then if it's up in the cloud, you've got a different billing model. You could
But the
enable
institution
that.
has to pay the cloud bill.
Pardon?
The institution has to pay the cloud bill.
It's whether the consumer pays the bill or not. Because what you could do is you could say all NSF-funded researchers should be allowed to use the compute facility of another institution for NSF-funded research, to do that computation. You could build some kind of business model to enable that, and that could be a really brilliant thing to do. I don't know. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, exactly. So, or actually, do you just, there's this stuff called money that allows you to trade services. Yeah, exactly. So, but no, it's a good point, because for some institutions, actually doing that might, increase, do give the university institution return on investment from a reputational viewpoint, or from, who knows.
And you're talking about it from the position of saying, I have some computational power. The flip side is there are other people out there who don't have it, and for them on this spectrum, it's an impediment. I've got some data, but I don't actually have the infrastructure.
So what you're saying is, I've got a ton of data, I want to make it available, but actually it's not that useful unless you run processing analysis against it.
Right.
But you can't move the data to the analysis, right? It makes no sense. Therefore, how do I? So I would say that is a business model, yeah. In terms of what's your business model?
And that's a different class machine. I mean, that's the other thing. The web services given to us by the university there's no cluster underlying the web services at the University of Illinois. I mean, anything that really computes, no one has access to, right?
Oh, really?
There's all kinds of
yeah.
Seriously. I mean, that's how the model works. Like the number of hoops you have to jump through to get an account, and to get on the actual compute hardware is a whole different. I think we just run like Microsoft Exchange server to serve most of our web content, right? For the university, right? We used to have all kinds of Linux boxes, but they don't. They just went to these network appliances, and so there's really no computation power sitting underneath anything that we expose to the world. Does that make any sense? I see
Absolutely.
that's two different.
Makes perfect sense.
So I don't know what the business model is with dumping this on Amazon or dumping it on Microsoft's cloud. I'm very keen to learn, actually.
Yeah, we don't have to have a solution here. I think it is it's an interesting business model where there's cloud providers, there's the ability for an institution to provide services, but it is an impediment today because it's not available. It's not.
I was just going to say at the Digital Economy All Hands in Newcastle a couple of weeks ago, Newcastle and others were presenting tools specifically for managing submission to Azure, Amazon, Google Apps. And the kind of the core component to that was the kind of the cost model, so that it was attributing every component back to the person who'd made the original submission. And part of the argument behind that was that then enabled like small scale humanities applications, humanities submissions, and you'd know this is going to cost you £200, and you know when you press the button that's what it's going to do, and you don't care about where it goes, how it's managed after that process, and that seemed like a really great model. No, it was on a job by job basis. You were entirely technology agnostic in the whole process. That sounded like a really good.
It's like
model.
10 cents per CPU hour, I think, or something like that. It's like the Azure cost. Depends on the machine. Pay more for a more powerful machine. But so the sort of transparent pricing model.
But where's the data live? That's why.
So on this, it's living.
I don't know. I can't remember whether kind of the storage was one of the costed components.
Yeah, probably.
I'm not sure.
Probably.
It was there was a Red Hat presentation.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, these are some of the things I think which come under business model sharing data. It's kind of interesting.
Well, it makes our lawyers crazy. Any perpetual contract would make the university lawyers free. Any ongoing contract. I mean, it'd have to be like the state would probably have to get involved. No, I'm not kidding. We are an instrument of.
Oh sure, yeah.
Of the state.
Yeah.
Right, and there's some really weird contract languages where contracts basically always have to be situated in Illinois. And the reason is you can't sue the state. That's basically why. So we run into trouble all the time situating contracts with things like Microsoft and Amazon and like, and technically we're not allowed to sign contracts with them because they live in California. Right? And with these, clouds, and where the hell is it, and what's going on? Seriously, it's just a make work project for the university.
Well, and the flip side of that, getting back to your example of saying, it's an economic issue about saying we as the institution want to provide services and potentially bill for those services. At the University of Washington, as a state-funded institution, they're not allowed to go and sell services back out that would potentially compete with industry.
Oh, really? Okay.
So in those cases, the state can't be competing. It is bizarre, but
Interesting. I'm gonna. Oh yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's back on the reward structure and incentive. I'm a little curious in that, if somebody just says, I'm just going to make all my data available and that's my reward, that's not really a very good metric. So somehow you've got to get a metric of impact, because I have modelers that turn out terabytes and nobody on the planet wants to look at that data again. And that's fine because they publish a paper and people want 0.1% of the data that was out there. And yet we're all in this push that everything's got to be out there, but the fact of the matter is nobody wants to look at it.
So I would say that's a return on investment calculation, right? Which is the investment in time and money to make the data available. Is it worth it? Yeah, is the impact. But the thing is, can you predict that? Because it might be actually, this is the view in the UK, is it's 10 years. It might be somebody in 9 years and 11 months who gets a Nobel Prize because you made your data available. Yeah.
One of the things Dan and I were talking about this morning is, can you go and look at the last 20, 30 years of data sharing and find out when those serendipitous events happen? You know, I know when NASA was putting together their data and information system for EOS, Bruce Barkstrom went and did a long use model and found that, you know, the long-term climate data records from satellites, there were really about 10 people who ever looked at that entire data set. There are thousands who look at little snippets. And yet where is that return? How do you make money on something for those 10 people? And it's based on the fact that you get those little snippets. And I think no one's ever really gone through and looked at, there's got to be a business case to make that.
That's maybe something we should do as part of this project. Let's go and look for those examples. That's a good idea. I like it. Yeah, that's interesting.
Do we want to move on to this one, or are we?
Yeah,
on
okay.
the,
Could I just ask a clarification about the human bit again?
Yeah.
Is there a stance in terms of cross-domain activities? Because when you were talking about collaboration, you were still, there was a lot of talk about kind of domain practices and, domain ontologies, and isn't the great potential that the kind of the kind of domain collapse is facilitated by interesting means of sharing data? How are we going to kind of express that or explore that in this model?
So do you think we should distinguish between collaborative piece apart?
Yeah, because I think
within my domain and collaboration across domain.
Oh, I think we've done
Cross
that.
domains,
We have
yeah.
got that in. You probably forgot because
maybe it's just all the examples sounded like
So
they were
what's,
to do with
what's-
collaborative working within a domain of study.
Yeah, no, it is captured in that second one. So it's collaboration within my domain, collaboration across domains, collaboration across different organizations,
Yeah.
and then actually then engaging with the public as the four.
And then it's the question whether making the data, these in large data sets together creates new domains as a consequence of that availability that you have.
Yeah.
But maybe that's more of a philosophical question.
It's a little bit philosophical, but yeah.
Or if you have all of the climate science data and you have whatever, some kind of, I don't know, human origin stroke, Paleolithic data set and what happens then when you bring them together? Is it a new form of disciplinary practice that can only exist as a consequence of
Well, it's web science, right? It's an
shared.
example of that, where they've got social science, computer science. They've kind of done a mashup. Because the computer scientists can obviously bring a lot of data in and a lot of analytics technology from the computer science web domain. The sociologists can bring in lots of analysis methods from the social sciences domain. And the two of those things together allow you to study the web as a socio-technical system, socio-economic technical system.
So then it's the way into the cloud of data via a domain structure, or is there another way of getting access to that cloud of data?
Not sure.
Okay.
Has anyone else got a comment on that?
I think I hear what you're saying, and that's. I think ultimately, can we turn this model back around and not be talking about it in terms of a domain-specific approach? The domain-specific approach is how we came to it, because most of the projects that we fund somebody say, I work in bio, I want to do X, can we do this? But ultimately, if you stand back and look at all the data that we gather, are there interesting trends that we spot here? Is there a way of looking at this overall data from the perspective of the data that is being gathered and the sorts of research globally that's being done around it? Or where are there serious dips that we see as impediments to that?
I think what I might do, I know what I'm going to do. The next bit, hang on. Sorry, I'm jumping around a bit, but I'm trying to follow the discussion.
One way I see you could get good feedback on this is you get a couple people from a couple different domains and you just give it to this and say, fill it in for your domain. You'll get really good feedback right away, right? So, I mean, once we get to that point, because I think people will then wrestle within their mind going, okay, how do we if it's a collaboration, is it small groups, or are we in this other area? And I think that'll help tease out some of it. Okay. Great. Yeah. Good.
Question is that sufficient? We've got two domains that validate our model, and we're throwing others.
Yeah. So that's this is the last iteration before we basically go out and do that. So again, if anyone's interested in being a case study here, that would be great. Any hands? I had one over here. Over here?
So,
no.
In answering that question, you don't have to volunteer yourself, but does anybody here say it would be really great to run domain X through this first?
I was going to put up my case study one. Yeah.
That's the other bit that we're going to start to gather out of this. Is not necessarily the end-to-end answer scenario for the whole domain, but bits that start to crystallize some of these individual facets, saying here's an example of where we see this working really well in bio.
So we've got archaeology, because Graham's doing it. Sci. We have a volunteer in hydrology. We have a chemist who. So those are some of the domains that we are now currently talking to. Right. Are there any domains where, it'd be interesting, is there a domain which you think is doing a really good job, for instance, that you would like to know how they're doing a good job?
Well, the music retrieval guys have been pretty good about sharing data sets, but they don't use them to make new discoveries. They use them for testing, right? They're essentially standardized test sets, right, to check how good the algorithms are doing. And they're doing a pretty decent job on that. The one data set that just popped up that is sort of getting shared and is kind of cool is the new million song data set. I'm going to mention it tomorrow. I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but if anyone can get internet access and Google the million song data set. Sorry? Yeah. So anyway, it's out of Columbia, and it's a joint project with the Echo Nest. I don't know why it's called the Echo Nest, but it's what it's called. It's a startup in Boston that came out of the Media Lab that does essentially music signal processing, what it does. But they went and crunched because they got credentials. They went and got them. Someone gave them 1 million songs. And they crunched it. And so essentially they're not giving away the songs, they're giving away the features. And it's open, actually. I just got an email, which I can't read, talking about that at this very second. So that's why it just popped in my mind. So there might be some new discoveries out of there. But so we used, in the music, we used these data sets, and I'll talk about some of them tomorrow, for testing algorithms. And it's a different model than some of the chemistry stuff and the hydrology stuff. They're not making any new findings, really and truly. A lot of it's annotated, so it's ground truth what it is.
The result of that signal processing is itself data.
Yes, it can be. Yeah, it can be. Yeah, it can be.
So oceanography is an interesting one because of the cost of data gathering, right? So certainly in the UK, where I used to be is the National Oceanography Centre. So I know some, and that's where NERC have their data centre. And I might ask Mark nicely. Or one of his people, yeah. So, but I think that's an interesting, in terms of sort of environmental science, I think oceanography is one of the more interesting.
What about the Met data from the UK?
Which is now hosted on Azure.
It is on Azure, yeah.
As of about a week ago. So that whole climate science, I think, is a...
So one other
ecology
example,
is one that...
To see if we get other thoughts out of the room, is in the biospace, one of the examples that came up was with things like the protein data bank as part of the process of doing research, that it's embedded to that extent within the domain that people are publishing directly into that shared, centralized, in that case, repository. Are there other examples of domains where that you mentioned the archive earlier as a place for publishing preprints, but in terms of publishing data as a matter of course, as a matter of the way that science gets done? Does anybody have other?
No, I think you've got a strong one. You get Alex and George to do. No, but it would be good because, from their perspective,
from their perspective, there's some stuff that they've actually done right, and then but they also know how it had to get done to get there, and so it's a interesting thing for them to also look at. So yeah.
I mean, I wonder if that would be useful as like I mentioned earlier, having this be a study of how things have happened in the domains, but we got some of those domains to talk about. If you had it all to do over again, how would you change it? What order would you act things?
I think that's the thing with this model. It is looking at sort of stepping stones to get to a full capability across the board, so that you've nailed the legal issues, you've got the skills and training, you've got the technical ability, you've got buy-in from all your stakeholders, and that's sort of nirvana, basically. And how do I get there? And that's kind of what the model is supposed to do, is to characterize where you are now, so that you can sort of navigate, essentially, you know, where do I have to go next? Which for a funder, there's a role there. But certainly for a researcher or a group of researchers, you know, hey, let's get together, let's put together a grant proposal to say, this will create a step change in our discipline, and we have used this model in order to analyze where there's a huge gap, and we're going to fill that gap, fix it, and this will create a step change, and we'll get loads of Nobel Prizes. You know, that's kind of some of the thinking behind the model in terms of how it could be of value to a researcher, particularly a researcher who is interested in data-intensive science. You know, it could be in your discipline where you see that gap, or you team up with someone in another discipline where you know how to do it, and you identify a discipline where actually you know exactly how to fix their problem. And that's often how, in my experience, how things have moved forward, and actually where you can get a step change, because you're leveraging someone else's experience. You don't have to make all those mistakes again, essentially. So that's another, you know, take on this model, is we don't want people to just reinvent the wheel, make the same mistakes, just in a different discipline.
Did AHRC have a data center model of some sort that worked or didn't work, that kind of fell apart? Yeah. What happened to that? Yeah, AH. Yeah.
Only archaeology survived.
It's being filmed, right? So that no, the Arts and Humanities Data Service no longer exists and is no longer. So there's no core funding. The Archaeology Data Service continues to be core funded by the AHRC, but some of the components of the AHDS still exist. So like the Oxford Text Archive is still there, up and running. They just found different funding models.
Okay. So are there any other... sorry. Yeah, please jump in.
Talking about the Oxford Text Archive, the domain of philologists is a quite old domain that produced data. Their data are the texts, actually, and they typed them into computers very early in the 60s. They started with that and have a long history of, well, standardization in interdomain. These are very a huge variety of disciplines. You have people having Old Greek and Latin, and others and any other languages. So that's not one community, but a large group of communities, but that have a long history of preserving their research data and well managed to create a common standard for all of these things called text encoding initiative. So that might be an interesting point.
Is that phonologists like that?
Philologists.
Philologists.
Yes.
Philologists. Is that what?
Philologists.
And TEI is the Text Encoding Initiative. So.
Okay. Any other sort of interesting... Any other... So any other case studies that might be of interest?
Well, it's a hot interest, but the thing's ongoing. It just started, right? So I don't know whether it's successful yet or not successful, right? So mentioned the whole HathiTrust.
So who's that? That's the
HathiTrust, thank you.
H-A-T.
H-I, it means elephant or something in Sanskrit, right? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, my boss is big in it, John Unsworth, who was the person who was supposed to be coming in my place. So anyway, so that, and then you have, what about the digging into data challenges? I'm just thinking on the arts and humanities side. So whatever the ones that got funded,
Yeah.
I don't know what they're doing right now, whether they're ongoing. I know our project's still going. Yeah, so there might be something there.
Yeah. So we're trying to basically test the model in a few domains. So I've got a question which, just really in the sort of wrap up, is this is kind of where we are. So this is kind of the summary. So what I'm interested in is what we do next. So by the end of this project, we'll have built a model, okay, which will essentially be a bunch of topics with a scale where we've tested it against a few different domains. And we'll publish that, so you'll be able to see essentially the capability of these different domains using the model. We'll publish that, and that'll be the end of the project. So just to get some feedback on what you might want to happen next. Do you just not care and are not going to use this, and that's fine? I'd be very disappointed. We'd be very disappointed. But, that might happen.
People with the money are starting to care.
Yeah. Or, what... I mean, one of the examples, for instance, that Liz got from the Bath interviews was a predictive model that says, this is where my discipline is today, and if I took this action, it would shift along these axes to hopefully improve my capability. So the predictive tool, would that be an interesting thing? I see blank faces.
So I would say, I'm not sure.
I think for each of those sliders, it would be actually, I'm not sure a predictor tool would do it, but just here's what the best examples are, kind of case of how people have done it, because it's going to always be different in different areas. So I think it's very hard on a tool to say, okay, we have a model that we know exactly. If you spend money on collaboration, you'll increase these. Yeah. So I would say more, instead of something like that, going, these are the things you could do that have been successful in other areas that have helped go to that. Because every discipline is going to be a little bit different on how they do it, and it still relies on people.
So it's more. So actually, it is this diagnosis tool. Sort of mode.
Yeah. It's something you as a domain could
you could build an expert system. Oh
yeah.
No.
Can look at it and you say.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
But you can also then have the discussion amongst folks in the community to say, maybe we should do more in this or cross collaboration, and we should figure out how to reward it within the scientific domain, right? And not just you're going to reward it for it at the institutional domain.
So it's a way of sort of enabling discussions around which directions to go, rather than I'm going to build a tool, I'm going to invest $1 million here, and everything will be fine.
I'd like some guidance on how business dudes are always talking in biz schools about the build or buy decision. Right, where they do all these analyses and they make the decision on whether they're going to buy a service or build it themselves. It's all hand-waving to me, but I know that they take it seriously. But yeah, there's some. If you could help it, because we've had these arguments about levels. I mean, does this stuff? At what point does it remain in the lab, right? And the responsibility of the PI, which always gives me the willies, because PIs move. So what happens then, right? They can't take their cluster with them.
Yeah.
Right? So would we just mothball the cluster and the data, and then we get in trouble? But yeah, so at what level, if we can get some guidance on, what's a reasonable expectation for a lab level responsibilities, and maybe college level, right, where the deans, are responsible for, and at what point is it institutional state a national problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at some point, if NSF keeps harping on about these damn data plans that we have to do, maybe they should build a ginormous data center and they can deal with it, right? It's their money, right?
So that's the NERC approach.
Sorry?
That's the Natural Environmental Research Council approach in the UK, or certainly was they built some data centers.
Yeah, well, we already know
the
it failed for
sustainability
humanities.
model for that, I'm not quite sure at the current state of that, but
yeah, just, you know,
the Engineering Physical Research Council, who just put out their research data management framework, said they're very explicit in saying we are not building a data center, and it's up to researchers and institutions to make sure that the data is archived for 10 years.
Yeah,
so yes, there are different models. So there are different models.
But yeah, is what you're asking for though?
You want guidance?
An articulation of those models and examples of where it's. We could do that. It'd be pretty easy to come up with areas at least where the different models exist. I think it is.
I mean, like that. I'd like to know more about what all the good intentions of the one that's near and dear to my heart, the humanities data center.
So yeah, lessons learned basically.
Yeah.
Guidance, lessons learned. Yeah, no, that's good. And again, I think it's the interesting thing here is if the model allows you to systematically unpick that, along these different axes, rather than just it being a discussion in the bar and it was terrible. But actually systematically you can look and say actually, because it may be in that service there were some good things about it, right? And it was something else that broke it.
So I can see a series of areas across this whole model where that might be an interesting.
Which again is definitely fits in this So more sort of example based to some extent, So it's sort of almost examples of good practice. Hey, best practice. I've heard that before. Yeah. Okay. That's very, very useful. That is good. So
9 minutes left now.
Okay, so we got sorry.
So your project maybe could find out the answer to the question: why did the UK Arts and Humanities data center didn't really work? What was the failure? Why was there a failure? Because the idea of having public-funded data centers, I think, was the right idea, and it might turn out it was just a political thing that somebody just didn't want to spend that money anymore. But if not, what was the reason for that failure? That would be an interesting question.
Yeah.
I'll try to resist answering the question. It's a great example. And I was at a Sustaining Digital Resources workshop organized under an NSF project with Ithaca a little while back in Washington. And one of the really interesting things we did was run around with Post-it notes, putting them on flip charts, about patterns for success and anti-patterns for success. And top one anti-pattern for success was, or if you like, failure pattern, was a hub and spoke model. And AHDS had that model. And so did the eSocial Science program before they changed the model, and I took it over. It's an interesting observation.
So interestingly, Microsoft documents these things in what's called patterns and practices.
Right.
So maybe that's actually an approach here, patterns and practices for eScience.
Data-intensive research.
Yeah, that's good.
So one activity you might want to monitor a little bit is this whole NSF EarthCube approach, where they're really trying to do a lot of these kinds of issues.
I'll tell you what we could do.
I don't know where they are right now. It was
I know there's
the most bizarre process I'd ever seen come out of
NSF. I did notice there were 111 white papers submitted, because I did have a look, but it could be quite interesting to sort of apply this model to that problem. Yeah.
I've been there.
So NSF, I think, are involved in this project. In that we're talking to NSF as a funding agency in terms of
the last of the workshops that said TBD in 2012 in Washington D.C. is really going to be focused much more on the funding agency perspective on this.
Is that the Office of Cyber Infrastructure you're talking to, or?
I don't know who yet. I don't think it's been determined. We're gonna invite broadly.
Speaking of the application of the model, what is your vision of what this model is supposed to generate, and how this data, this information will be used? You can think of producing some indices. Let's say hydrology is 50% capable, or geochemistry is 36% capable. Yeah.
And my domain is better than your domain.
Exactly. Or that institution is certain.
So we are, one of the outputs from the projects will be visualization. So how do we visualize this model in some form?
Yeah, and we, Chris, I'll get right to you. We did think about that, and we don't want it to be used that way. We want it to be used much more in the sense of, this is where I am, this is where I want to get to. Here are some patterns that exist in other domains that I can draw upon. But it's interesting to, coming up with an index that even the examples when we were sort of saying, here's some ideas of visualization, very quickly led themselves to say, oh, well then how do I compare, how do I rank against other domains?
Competitive, that everyone will be inventing indices so that they're best.
Yeah.
So these aren't well thought through ideas, but they're a little controversial. So I'll just throw them out there, but I'm not wedded to them. Well, and before I say anything, I think this effort is really interesting. Of course, I'd like this today because this is something funders care about: is where to invest. But it just strikes me that one way of looking at this model is kind of like a Myers-Briggs test. And the advantages of that is that there's no bad personality. Whereas this is definitely taking an opinion that if you are in one end of the spectrum, there's something wrong with you, and that you naturally will want to be in the higher level.
No.
Well, you have a point of view of where you want to go. Now, so your scale from beginning to professional kind of implies kind of a weighting. If there was a way to kind of frame this where the scales are not kind of beginner, novice to professional, you actually might be able to get something interesting that maybe not everyone wants to be at a certain place on all three dimensions. And the other thing is you might get a kind of personality for a discipline at a snapshot, and then they can determine kind of where they might want to model, and you might get pros and cons of those. So that's kind of one controversial idea, or potentially controversial idea. And then the other one is, and something I've been thinking a lot about, is that because there's a lot of interesting science happening between disciplines, I'm starting to not think about disciplines in terms of how we focus funding. And the one way that we're thinking about is organizing by data type. So if you think about, say, PDB, that's a data type. That's not necessarily just a single discipline. And it's been very successful. Pardon? Oh, sorry, yeah. But someone mentioned it before. So these successes in different disciplines in sharing data are places where kind of all the data need to go in order to do your science. All your data need to go here, or they and those are not everyone who studies say astronomy uses the kind of central data stores for astronomy. Sometimes they do other stuff, or there's different kinds. So the discipline way of focusing this might not hit the mark as much as trying to focus it on data types and communities.
So I think a community could be the
anyone
community
who
around
uses this kind of data. Yeah.
Data type. That's interesting. Well, yeah, that's interdisciplinary, but based around different disciplines who use the same piece of data, basically.
Well, I was thinking, data's a big in linked data world, right? So we've always been this talks about showing the music guys connecting to
seriously, why not?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll write that down.
I might do that one tomorrow. Yes.
That's another proposal there, yeah.
Right, so essentially that is sort of an interdisciplinary kind of connection, right? So I don't know where that fits in your model, but sort of, and the university is getting really big, at least in the rhetoric, about promoting interdisciplinary research. Whether anything's ever happened or actually accomplished is a different thing, but I know the rhetoric sort of.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce the two comments there. The first one is rather like the medical analogy we had at the beginning. If you go to the doctor because there's something you want, one of the things they might do is a test to find out whether you have a particular gene or a particular blood type, then you'll get your personalized medicine. You're not better than anyone else or worse than anyone else, it's just you have that blood type. So, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I like that one. The other thing is the disciplinary piece. I was at an event recently in the UK for the digital economy program, and the two buzzwords they're using are post-disciplinary. So I thought I'd share that with you. Yes, and also co-creation. Everything is co-creation.
So all research domains are equal, but some are more equal than others, right?
Yeah. That's interesting. That's interesting. Mark, you? Yeah.
I was just going to add one thing. When you put up the model at the beginning, it was awfully static, and it might be useful to get the domains to at least identify what they think some of the forces are that are driving them. For example, astronomy's got to say facilities.
Yeah.
And others are looking at public policy. You've got,
The
commercialization.
drivers,
It would
drivers,
be useful to know
that is
because
very
that might help elucidate why are they doing things the way they do. Why is the NIH data system budget the same as the entire NSF
I think
budget?
I kind of put that under business model in terms of what's the business model for a discipline. And the business model is big facilities. And so, yeah, so I think, no, fantastic. And things like, Earth observation, when we started putting satellites up, it kind of changed the game, right? And yeah, absolutely. No, that's really good. So I think we probably want to wrap up.
Yeah, I think so.
So
It's
the next
feeling
steps.
Like beer o'clock.
Yeah, so the next steps basically is we're going to take all of this input from here. Hopefully, I think they're still probably running in Bristol because they're an hour behind. So there's about 30 or 40 people in Bristol having this discussion, but research librarians and different community, and from the other workshops. Great discussion here. Thank you for that. And we're going to synthesize that into a sort of draft white paper. Okay.
We'll put it at this URL.
This is the website here. That's my email, and that's Liz's email. So certainly, contact us, or we can obviously carry on talking. And the case studies, I think we've got some great ideas here for different ways of doing those case studies, and not just discipline, but other ones which would be interesting. I think an interesting portfolio of case studies looking at this from different angles. So that, I think, has been a really good outcome from today. And then we do have these workshops where we're basically going to present then these case studies and the application of the model, and then take it from there. So I just want to thank you all for coming, contributing. It's been a great discussion, certainly for us in the project team. Fantastic to get your input on that. So thank you very much.